It was the summer of 2016, and for some reason I still can't fully explain, I decided to camp alone in the old Stonefield graveyard just outside a small rural town in northern England. I had been camping for years, mostly in forests or by lakes, but I'd never tried anything like this. The graveyard sat at the end of a long, narrow lane that wound between overgrown hedges and dry stone walls. It hadn't been used for decades. At least that's what I'd read online. The newer burials were in a modern cemetery 2 miles away. This place was nothing more than crumbling headstones, moss, and leaning trees that had been left to grow wild. I'd arrived late in the afternoon, around 6 p.m. The air was warm and still, but the sky had a heavy, dull look as if rain might come later. My rucksack felt heavier than usual, stuffed with a small tent, sleeping bag, food, and a torch. The gate to the graveyard was rusted but not locked. It squealed loudly when I pushed it open, a sound that echoed in the stillness and immediately made me feel exposed. The grass was knee-high in places, dotted with white wildflowers and thick patches of nettles. The stones were worn smooth by time, many of them tilting or half sunken into the soil. I picked a spot near the back corner, close to a large yew tree whose branches hung low enough to offer some cover. The ground there was uneven, full of shallow dips where the earth had settled over old graves, but I found a relatively flat patch just big enough for my small tent. Setting it up took longer than it should have. The grass was thick and tangled, and my pegs kept hitting buried stones. Sweat ran down my back as I worked, and all the while I kept glancing around, feeling like I was being watched even though the place was deserted. Once the tent was up, I sat on my rucksack and ate a sandwich, watching the light fade. By 8 p.m., the sun was low and casting long shadows through the crooked gravestones. The air grew cooler, and the first signs of wind began to rustle the tree branches overhead. Somewhere far off, I could hear the low rumble of thunder. I walked around for a bit before it got fully dark, weaving between graves, reading the faded names and dates. The oldest I could make out was from the late 1700s, the letters almost gone. Some graves had stone borders that had cracked and shifted. Others were nothing more than a lump in the ground, the marker long gone. The yew trees seemed to soak up the remaining light, their trunks gnarled and roots twisting through the soil like veins. By the time I returned to the tent, the clouds had thickened and the air smelled like rain. I zipped myself inside, laid out my sleeping bag, and tried to relax. Outside, the wind picked up, making the tent walls shiver and pop. Leaves scraped across the ground. The rain began not long after, soft at first, then heavier, pattering on the tent and dripping through the trees. I lay there in the dark, listening. Normally, the sound of rain calms me, but here it felt different. The noise seemed to mask other sounds, making me strain my ears. I thought I heard something moving through the grass nearby, a slow rustling like someone dragging their feet. I told myself it was probably a fox or a badger, maybe even a hedgehog nosing through the weeds. The movement stopped. The rain kept falling. My breathing felt too loud inside the tent. Then, from somewhere to my left, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not quick, not heavy, just slow and deliberate, like someone taking careful steps along the old path. My skin prickled instantly. I froze completely, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps drew closer, stopping and starting as if whoever it was kept pausing to listen. I knew there was no reason for anyone to be in this graveyard at night. The road was far off, and the lane leading here was barely passable by car. My mind began running through possibilities. Teenagers messing around, someone from the village out walking, maybe even a drunk who'd stumbled in. But none of those ideas made me feel any better. The steps reached a point just beyond my tent, no more than a few meters away. I could hear the wet grass swish with each movement. Then they stopped completely. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might be audible. The rain filled the silence. I didn't dare look out. I stayed still, gripping the torch but keeping it off. After what felt like minutes, the steps began again, but this time they moved around the side of the tent, slow and steady. I could hear the soft squelch of mud underfoot, the faint brushing of fabric against long grass. They passed behind me, then moved toward the yew tree, and then nothing. I waited, counting the seconds, trying to convince myself they'd left. But I couldn't hear any footsteps moving away, no gate opening, just the rain and the wind. Eventually, after maybe 20 minutes, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. My torch beam cut through the wet air, lighting up the gravestones. Nothing moved. The grass glistened, the trees swayed, but there was no sign of anyone. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound kept me alert. The creak of branches, the hiss of rain, the occasional plop of water from leaves onto the tent. My body ached from lying tense for hours. When the sky began to lighten in the early morning, I packed up quickly, shoving everything into my rucksack without bothering to eat. I made my way toward the gate, glancing back often. The ground was slippery, and the grass soaked my trousers. Just before I left, I noticed something in the mud near the yew tree. Footprints, large, boot-shaped, the tread still clear despite the rain. They led from the path around my tent and back toward the far wall of the graveyard, but they didn't go to the gate. They stopped abruptly at the wall, as if whoever made them had just stood there for a while. I followed them with my eyes. The wall was about 5 feet high, topped with uneven stones. Beyond it was a thick tangle of brambles and trees. No obvious path. I stood there in the drizzle, feeling the hair on my neck rise again. Whoever had been there last night hadn't left the way they came in. I didn't stick around to think about it. I walked quickly down the lane, the cold morning air biting at my face. My boots squelched with each step. I didn't look back at the gate. When I reached my car, parked where the lane met the main road, I sat inside for a long moment before starting the engine. My hands were shaking. I told myself it could have been nothing, just someone curious, maybe cutting through the area. But deep down, I knew there was no reason for anyone to be wandering around an abandoned graveyard in the middle of a stormy night. It's been years since that night, but I still remember the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps and the way they circled me in the dark. I've camped many places since, but I've never gone near Stonefield again. Some places you just don't go back to, not because of ghosts or old stories, but because of the people who might be out there watching when you think you're alone. I was 24 in the summer of 2016, working long hours at a warehouse in Indiana. By the time July came, I'd saved enough for a week off. I wanted to get away from the noise, the forklifts, the stale air, and the constant smell of cardboard and diesel. I packed up my old Ford Ranger and drove south toward Kentucky, where I knew there were patches of forest big enough to feel like I was hundreds of miles from anyone. I'd been camping alone before, but never for more than a night. This time, I planned to stay 3 days. I pulled into a small gravel parking lot at the edge of the Daniel Boone National Forest. There was a faded wooden sign, a couple of bullet holes in it, warning about bears and ticks. No ranger station, no campground map, just a dirt trail heading into the trees. That was exactly what I wanted. No other people, no RVs humming in the background, no shouting kids. Just me, the forest, and quiet. The air was humid but still, the kind of stillness where you can hear your own breathing. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and started walking. I wanted to set up camp far from the trail, deep enough that no one wandering by would spot me. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing surrounded by dense oak and hickory. A downed tree on one side acted like a natural barrier, and I could see the faint shimmer of a creek through the trees on the other. Perfect. I pitched my small tent, hung my food in a dry bag from a high branch, and gathered enough wood for a small fire. The sun sank and the forest changed. Birds quieted down. The buzzing of insects grew sharper, almost louder. Somewhere in the distance, a single tree frog started up, then another, until it felt like the whole place was breathing in its own rhythm. That first night was uneventful. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the creak and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. Normal forest sounds, animals moving around, wind shifting through the leaves. The second day was hot. I spent the morning fishing the creek, catching a few small trout. I cooked them over the fire, bones crackling in the heat. I spent the afternoon exploring further into the woods. I saw deer tracks, a raccoon near the creek, even a hawk swooping low over the treetops. By late afternoon, I was tired and ready to just sit by the fire until dark. That's when I noticed something. About 30 yards from my tent, in a patch of dirt near the base of an old maple, there were footprints. Not animal prints, boot prints. The ground was soft from rain 2 days earlier, and these looked fresh. The edges were sharp, the tread clear. Someone had been here. The odd thing was, the prints didn't come from the direction of the trail. They seemed to appear from the woods themselves, curve slightly around my camp, and vanish into thicker brush. I told myself it could be a hunter or another camper passing through. Still, I didn't like it. I decided to be more alert. I ate dinner with my back against the log so I could see in all directions. As the sun dropped, the woods seemed to grow darker faster than the night before, like the trees were closing in a little earlier than they should. That night, I woke up twice. The first time was around midnight. I thought I heard something soft, not twigs snapping, but the sound of weight shifting on damp ground. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the creak again. The second time was closer to 3 a.m., when I woke to what sounded like a slow, steady crunch of leaves. Not an animal darting around, but something heavier, deliberate. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, then stopped completely. By morning, I was uneasy. I thought about packing up and heading back, but it felt stupid to ruin the trip over some footprints. I told myself it was nothing, maybe even my own prints from before that I hadn't noticed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went about my day as planned, but I stayed closer to camp. Around noon, while gathering more wood, I noticed something else. Behind a thick clump of brush about 20 yards from my tent, there was a small piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was dark, maybe black or navy, torn from clothing. When I pulled it free, I saw that it was part of a shirt sleeve, frayed edges smelling faintly of sweat. That was enough to put me on edge. I kept glancing toward the trees, scanning for movement. The forest suddenly felt bigger, deeper, like there were more places for someone to be hiding than I could ever check. That evening, I built my fire higher than usual. The crackle of the flames made me feel a little safer. I kept my knife close and my flashlight in my pocket. I ate quickly, barely tasting my food, just wanting to get inside the tent and zip it tight. It was around midnight when I woke again, not to sound this time, but to the faint glow of my fire still burning outside. I could see it through the thin fabric of the tent. And then I realized something. I hadn't left it that high. The flames were higher than they should have been. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. My stomach went tight. Someone had stacked more wood on my fire. Fresh wood, still damp at the ends. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The trees were still, no movement, but I knew someone had been here. Recently, I waited for what felt like hours, sitting in the tent with my knife in my hand, staring at the dim outline of the fire through the fabric. No footsteps, no voices, no movement, just that lingering fact in my head. I hadn't added that wood. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I packed my gear fast, shoving everything into my backpack without folding or sorting. I didn't even eat breakfast. The whole hike back, I kept glancing behind me, convinced I'd see someone standing there, just far enough back to keep pace but not close enough to see clearly. I didn't see anyone. The gravel lot was empty when I reached it. My truck was untouched. But as I tossed my pack into the bed and got in, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On the passenger side door handle, smeared faintly into the dust, was a print. Not a fingerprint, but the shape of a palm. I drove out of there without looking back. I didn't stop until I was 2 towns over, parked in a gas station lot, drinking burnt coffee just to have something warm in my hands. I haven't camped alone since. I still think about those footprints, the shirt sleeve, the fire. Whoever was out there never tried to speak, never came into the light, never made their presence fully known. But they wanted me to know they were there, and that was worse than anything else. I had been hunting alone for a few years, and I had gotten used to the quiet. It was November 2011, just outside the small town of Red Hill, Montana. I was 32 then, used to the cold, and stubborn enough to think I could handle a 3-day trip on my own. The plan was to set up camp near a ridge I knew, track some elk, and head back before the next storm rolled in. The weather was dry but sharp, with that kind of air that burned your lungs if you breathed too deep. I parked my old Chevy at the edge of an old logging road, threw my pack over my shoulder, and hiked in about 3 miles. The spot I picked to set up camp was a small clearing by a slow, shallow stream. The ground there was covered in frost, the kind that made your boots crunch. I pitched my tent facing east so the morning light would hit it first thing. I set my rifle down beside a small pile of firewood I'd gathered and boiled some water for coffee before heading out to scout the ridge. The woods were dead quiet. No wind, no birds, not even the usual cracking of branches in the distance. Just the sound of my boots against frozen ground and the occasional click of the safety on my rifle when I adjusted it. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals get scarce when the temperature drops that low. I climbed higher, scanning for tracks, but the only fresh ones I saw were a few deer hoof prints cutting across a narrow game trail. By late afternoon, I circled back to camp with nothing to show for it. The sun was already dipping behind the ridge, and that heavy, bluish shadow started swallowing the forest. I lit a small fire, ate a can of beans, and sat listening to the tiny pops from the wood burning. The silence was so complete that every sound, the hiss of my breath, the crack of ice melting near the stream, seemed too loud. Around 8 p.m., I killed the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag. The cold seeped through the ground into my bones, even with the thick mat beneath me. I lay there for a while, staring at the thin nylon above me, waiting for sleep. That's when I heard it. A single, deliberate crunch of snow just beyond the tent. I froze. I thought maybe it was a deer wandering too close, but then there was another step and it was heavier. It wasn't the quick, nervous shuffle of an animal. It was slow, careful, like someone was trying not to be noticed. My rifle was next to me, and I gripped it tight, staying perfectly still. The steps stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. After a minute, I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked out. The clearing looked empty. My breath was visible in the air, hanging there like smoke. I stayed like that, staring, until my eyes watered from the cold. Then, I zipped the tent back up and told myself it was nothing. But I didn't sleep much. The next morning, there were footprints. Not boot prints, not hooves, but the kind of shape you'd see from someone wearing thick winter boots. They came from the trees, circled the tent, and then went back the way they came. I stood there for a long time, looking at them. The snow was hard-packed, so I couldn't tell how fresh they were, but they hadn't been there yesterday afternoon. I'd been all over this clearing, and I'd have noticed them. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me wanted to believe it was just some hiker who wandered too far. So I stayed. I told myself I'd just keep the rifle close and stay alert. The day went by slow. I hunted the ridge again, saw nothing, and came back before sunset. I skipped the fire that night. Didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold jerky inside the tent, listening. The forest stayed quiet until about 1 a.m. That's when I heard it again. The steps were farther this time, moving around the edge of the clearing. Then they stopped. For maybe an hour, nothing. Then, out of nowhere, a snapping sound like a branch breaking under weight came from just past the stream. I waited, rifle in hand, the safety off. My fingers ached from how hard I was gripping it. My mouth was dry, and I could feel sweat under my thermal shirt even though the air inside the tent was near freezing. When the first bit of light broke the next morning, I unzipped the tent and looked around. More footprints. Same size, same shape. They hadn't come closer than 20 feet this time, but they circled wide and disappeared into the trees on the north side. That was enough for me. I packed up camp in under 10 minutes. Every sound I made seemed too loud. The tearing of duct tape from my tent poles, the clink of my stove going into my pack. I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods still looked empty, but the feeling of being watched was like a weight pressing against my back. The hike back to the truck was the longest 3 miles of my life. Every so often, I'd stop and listen. Once, about halfway, I thought I heard something matching my pace off in the trees. When I stopped, it stopped. When I moved again, I didn't hear it anymore. When I finally reached the logging road, my truck was right where I left it, covered in a thin sheet of frost. I tossed my pack in the bed and got in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. My breath was shaking as much as my hands. I drove the whole way back to Red Hill without stopping. When I pulled into my driveway, the relief was so strong I just sat there for a while, engine running, staring at the frost melting off the windshield. Later that day, I called a friend who hunted the same area. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd seen some strange tracks and felt like someone was out there at night. He told me I wasn't the first person to say that. A few guys over the years had come back early, saying they thought someone was moving around their camps while they slept. No one ever caught anyone, and nothing was ever taken. Just footsteps. I never went back to that ridge. I still hunt, but only with friends now. And I always keep a light on in camp at night. The sound of snow crunching under slow, deliberate steps has stayed in my head ever since, and the thought that whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to hurt me right then is the only reason I made it home. But I can't stop thinking, if I'd stayed one more night, maybe they would have decided otherwise. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a week off work and head out camping alone. I'd been working late shifts for months, feeling drained and restless, and I needed the quiet. I picked a spot deep in the northern Michigan woods, near a small lake I'd fished at years ago. I remembered it being empty, no trails leading in except for a rough dirt path. I packed light but enough to last 4 days: tent, sleeping bag, food, small stove, and a .22 rifle I sometimes brought for plinking cans. I left early in the morning, the sun just breaking over the horizon, the air cool and smelling faintly of pine. By mid-afternoon, I reached the dirt turnoff. The road in was narrower than I remembered. Branches scraped against my truck as I crawled forward, and a layer of wet leaves from a recent rain clung to the tires. I parked near a small clearing a few hundred feet from the lake. No signs of anyone else, no tire marks, no old fire pits, nothing. Just the sound of water lapping and the occasional thump of a pine cone hitting the ground. I set up my tent close to the tree-line, not far from where the ground sloped toward the water. The lake was calm, almost too still, with patches of green algae drifting lazily on the surface. Across the water, thick forest rose up, unbroken in any direction. I boiled water, made some instant noodles, and sat by the edge watching the sun dip lower. It was so quiet that when a fish jumped, it startled me. That first night, I woke around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint, somewhere far off in the woods, but distinct. A slow crunch of leaves, pause, then another. It wasn't the scatter of a raccoon or the quick steps of a deer. It sounded heavier. I lay still, eyes open in the darkness of my tent, my heart starting to pound. The sound came and went for maybe 10 minutes, then nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer anyway, rolled over, and eventually drifted back off. The next day passed without much happening. I spent the morning fishing, caught a small bass, and cooked it for lunch. I wandered along the shore, finding old beer cans rusted into the dirt, maybe from years ago. But there was something strange. Small piles of stones, each one neatly stacked, spaced along the tree-line about 20 or 30 feet apart. At first I thought maybe kids had done it, but they were too precise. Not natural, but not obvious why they'd be there. I brushed it off and headed back. That night it rained, hard. The sound on my tent was constant, drowning out everything else. Sometime after midnight I woke again. This time it wasn't footsteps, it was breathing. I couldn't tell if it was real or just the sound of rain warping in my head, but it felt close, heavy, almost like someone was just outside the tent wall. I stayed still, every muscle tense. The rain made it impossible to hear well. A minute passed, then two. I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent just enough to peek out with my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but sheets of rain and the dark shapes of trees. I closed it back up and sat awake until the sky started to lighten. The third day, I started feeling uneasy. I'd been looking forward to the solitude, but now it felt like the air itself was watching me. While walking up the dirt path to collect some dry wood, I saw boot prints. Not mine, these were bigger, wider, and they were fresh. The rain had cleared the ground last night, and these were sharp-edged, pressed into the mud. They came from deeper in the woods and stopped near the edge of my camp, then turned back. I felt my stomach twist. I kept busy, making food, tending the fire, but I kept glancing into the woods. By evening, I decided I was going to leave the next morning. The feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I loaded some gear into the truck early, just to make it easier. The sun set behind thick clouds, leaving the forest dim even before full dark. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, I didn't hear anything at first, just the faint ripple of water from the lake. I lay still, listening. Then came a long, slow drag sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It was faint, but it was there, somewhere between the tent and the tree-line. My throat went dry. I reached for the rifle beside me, keeping quiet. The dragging stopped. Silence. Then, footsteps again, deliberate, slow, circling. I held my breath. Suddenly, the soft crunching shifted to quick steps, moving away. I waited, heart pounding so loud it felt like it filled the tent. After a few minutes, I heard a splash from the lake. Not like a fish, too loud, too heavy. I stayed awake until the faintest hint of dawn. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was the wet outline of a boot print not 10 feet from my tent. The drag mark was real, cutting through the wet leaves toward the lake. My stomach turned cold. I walked to the water's edge and saw a patch where the weeds were flattened, leading into the shallows. I didn't waste time. I packed what was left, barely eating, constantly looking over my shoulder. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the mirror more than at the road ahead. It wasn't until I hit the main highway that I let out the tension I'd been holding for 3 days. I never reported it. What would I even say? Someone walked around my tent and dragged something into the lake? No proof, no faces, nothing. But sometimes, when I'm trying to sleep, I hear that same slow, dragging sound in my head, and I wonder not just what they were carrying, but if they were planning on taking me instead. It was late September 2015 when I decided to camp alone in the hills of northern Wales. The place wasn't too far from civilization, but far enough that when the sun went down, the only things you could hear were the wind moving through the grass and the distant sound of a stream. The forecast had warned about possible rain, but I didn't think much of it. I had camped in rain before. This time, I wanted the peace and stillness that came with being away from people. I parked my car a short walk down a muddy trail, carried my gear up a slope, and found a flat patch between two tall bushes where the wind wouldn't hit me directly. By the time I set up my tent, the clouds had already started gathering. They weren't the light, fluffy ones that pass harmlessly overhead, but heavy, swollen shapes that moved low across the sky. I could smell the rain before it started, that damp, earthy scent mixing with the faint sweetness of the nearby grass. I boiled some water for instant noodles, ate quietly, and watched the light fade. The sky turned from pale gray to a darker slate, and soon I could barely see the outline of the ridge in the distance. The first drops of rain came soft and spaced apart, tapping gently on the tent's fabric. I zipped the tent shut and lay back, listening to the rhythm. It was calming at first, but it didn't stay gentle for long. Within half an hour, the rain was a constant roar. The wind had picked up, pushing against the side of the tent so hard it made the poles tremble. I could hear the bushes outside thrashing, their leaves whipping together in the gusts. Water began to pool around the edges of the tent floor. I shifted my sleeping bag away from the damp corner, annoyed but not yet worried. Then, through the sound of the rain, I caught something different, a faint crunch, like a boot pressing into wet soil. I froze. It was so subtle I wondered if I'd imagined it. I listened harder, holding my breath. The rain hammered on, masking almost every other sound. But then it came again, a little closer this time. I tried to convince myself it was probably a branch falling or an animal moving through the grass. There were sheep in these hills, sometimes deer, but there was something about the rhythm of the steps, slow, deliberate, that didn't feel like an animal. My tent walls were thin, and with the rain hitting so hard, I could barely see shapes outside unless they were close. I sat up quietly, my sleeping bag rustling under me. My headlamp was within reach, but I didn't want to turn it on yet. I wanted my eyes to stay adjusted to the dark. Another step. This time it was unmistakable. The ground was soft from the rain, and I could hear the wet squelch of mud under weight. It was coming from the slope I had climbed earlier to get here. The steps stopped for a moment, and I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears. The rain masked most sounds, but every so often there was a break in the wind where I could pick out smaller noises. I thought I heard something metallic, like a faint clink of metal on metal, but it was gone before I could be sure. I considered unzipping the tent and calling out, but the thought of doing that made my stomach tighten. If it was just an animal, calling out might scare it off. But if it wasn't, drawing attention to myself in the dark didn't feel smart. I decided to wait and listen. Minutes passed, though it felt longer. Then I heard the steps again, circling now. Whoever or whatever it was had moved lower, to the other side of the bushes that shielded my tent from the wind. The shape of the sound told me they were close, maybe less than 30 feet away. The rain kept falling hard, but I could now make out a new noise. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through wet grass. Every hair on my arms stood on end. My breathing became shallow without me realizing. I didn't move, but my fingers had curled into tight fists inside my sleeping bag. It was pitch dark outside except for the occasional pale flash of lightning, which lit up the hills in quick bursts. One flash came, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure through the wet fabric of the tent. Just a vague outline, tall, standing still, facing in my direction. When the light vanished, the shape was gone, swallowed by the darkness again. The dragging sound stopped, replaced again by slow steps, this time moving away. My instinct told me to stay still and silent, so I didn't follow it with my eyes. I just listened as the sound faded into the rain. I thought it might be over, but then the steps returned, faster this time, splashing in the mud, heading straight for the tent. My whole body tensed. Without thinking, I reached for my pack where I kept a small folding knife. My hand stayed there, gripping it tight inside the pocket. The footsteps came right up to the bushes, then stopped dead. The pause felt endless. I couldn't hear breathing, couldn't hear movement, just the rain hammering down. Then, just as sudden as it had stopped, the sound of footsteps moved away again, back toward the slope. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening to every sound outside. The rain finally began to ease around 3 a.m., and the wind died down. My body ached from staying tense so long, and I kept imagining shapes moving outside. By the time daylight finally came, the ground was soaked and slippery. I stepped outside the tent slowly, my boots sinking slightly into the mud. The bushes dripped cold water onto my shoulders as I pushed through them to the slope. There, in the wet earth, were prints. Not the hoof marks of deer or the small tracks of a fox. These were heavy, deep impressions from boots, the tread clear even in the mud. They led up the slope toward the trail I had walked in on, and mixed among them were long, shallow grooves in the soil, as if something had been dragged alongside. I followed the prints for maybe 20 yards before they vanished into the mess of grass and puddles. My stomach felt tight the whole time, and I knew I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I packed up as fast as I could, my hands cold and stiff from the wet air. Back at the car, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. On the rear passenger side door, just above the handle, there was a streak of mud, a hand-shaped smear, for long fingers clearly visible. It hadn't been there when I left the car yesterday. I didn't wait around to think about it. I drove out of those hills without looking back, the rain starting to fall again in the mirror. Even now, years later, the sound of boots in mud still makes my skin crawl. It was the summer of 2014, and I had taken a week off work to get away from the noise of the city. I was 31 at the time, still living alone in a cramped flat in Birmingham, and I had started craving the kind of quiet you can only find in the countryside. I picked a small campsite in the Peak District, near a village called Edale. I'd been there once before, years ago, but this time I chose a more secluded pitch, away from the main path, closer to the edge of a small wooded area. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still high enough to light the rolling hills in soft gold. The site was sparsely populated, maybe 3 other tents scattered across the open field. I set up mine on a slight rise, the grass short but uneven, and the trees forming a sort of dark wall at my back. It felt safe enough, though I noticed there wasn't much between the campsite and the woods except a thin wire fence, barely waist-high, with a single gap near my tent where the ground dipped. After pitching the tent and setting up my small camping stove, I walked down to a nearby stream to refill my bottles. The air was cooler there, damp from the water, and I remember seeing a lone heron standing still in the shallows. By the time I got back, the sky had shifted to that soft evening blue, and the breeze had dropped to nothing. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I ate a simple meal of beans and bread, then sat on the folding chair outside my tent. I watched the light fade over the hills, the edges of the landscape blurring into shadow. The only sounds were distant sheep and the occasional rustle from the woods behind me. When the darkness settled fully, I climbed into my sleeping bag and switched off my torch. I don't know what time I first woke up. It must have been sometime after midnight because the air was cold enough to sting my nose, and there was condensation on the inside of the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind that had pulled me from sleep, a faint, steady sound of movement outside. But then I realized there was no wind. The trees weren't shifting. The fabric of the tent wasn't fluttering. The sound was more deliberate, like footsteps on damp grass. I stayed still, my eyes adjusting to the faint outline of the tent above me. The steps were slow, uneven, and they stopped for several seconds at a time, as if whoever or whatever was making them kept pausing to listen. My heart started to race, and I felt my hands getting clammy inside the sleeping bag. I told myself it could be another camper returning from the toilet block. But the sound wasn't coming from the direction of the facilities. It was coming from the trees, from the gap in the fence behind my tent. The steps came closer until they were just outside the thin nylon wall at my back. I could hear the grass being crushed under weight and the faint sound of breathing. It wasn't heavy or labored, but it was close enough that I could tell it was human. I didn't move. I kept my breathing shallow, praying they would just keep walking past. But they didn't. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like a full minute, silent except for the faint shift of their feet. Then there was the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. Not a full touch, more like the back of a hand dragging lightly across the fabric. I felt a wave of heat flood my face despite the cold. My mind was racing through options. Should I unzip the tent and confront them, or just stay silent and hope they left? I didn't have any kind of weapon, not even a heavy torch. My penknife was buried somewhere in my rucksack, and I wasn't about to start rummaging for it in the dark. Then, slowly, the steps began again, moving away from the tent. I waited until the sound faded completely before I dared to move. I slid out of the sleeping bag, pulled on my boots, and unzipped the tent just enough to look out. The campsite was almost pitch black except for a dim orange glow in the far distance from someone else's dying campfire. My breath clouded in front of me, and I strained my eyes toward the woods. That's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the tree-line, partly hidden by the shadows. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old dark coat that reached his knees. I couldn't make out his face. It was either in shadow or turned slightly away, but I could see the pale skin of his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing my direction. I froze. My legs felt like they were locking into place. I kept staring at him, waiting for him to turn or walk away, but he stayed exactly where he was. The cold air seemed heavier, pressing against my ears. After maybe 10 seconds, though it felt much longer, he stepped backward into the darkness until I couldn't see him anymore. I stood there for another minute, barely breathing, before zipping the tent shut again. Sleep was out of the question. I sat upright inside the tent, torch in my lap, listening to every faint sound outside. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the idea of stepping out into the dark again made my stomach twist. I stayed like that until the first faint light of morning began to touch the hills. The relief I felt when the sky turned pale was like a physical thing. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the dew-wet grass, scanning the edge of the woods. There was no sign of anyone. Still, when I walked toward the gap in the fence, I noticed the grass there was flattened, as if someone had stood in the same spot for a while. I followed the trail into the first few feet of the woods, and sure enough, there were more crushed patches, leading deeper in. I didn't go far. I didn't want to know how far the tracks went. I packed up quickly, barely stopping to eat. By the time the sun was fully over the hills, I was on the road heading back toward Birmingham. Even as I drove, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone walking along the verge. It's been years since that night, but the image of him, standing just inside the trees, still and silent, has never left my mind. I don't know if he was a local, a drifter, or someone with far worse intentions. All I know is that he wasn't there by accident. He had walked through the woods in the middle of the night, straight to the back of my tent. And for reasons I'll never understand, he had just stood there, listening to me breathe. I haven't camped alone since. I went camping alone in northern Arizona in October of 1998. I was 22 at the time, fresh out of college, and working a job that I hated in Phoenix. I'd been telling myself for months that I needed a break from the city noise, the constant hum of traffic, the neon glow outside my apartment window. I wanted cold air, the smell of pine, and nights where the stars didn't have to fight through pollution to be seen. I drove north for hours, letting the road rise slowly into the high country until the dry desert scrub turned into dense forest. By the time I reached the Coconino National Forest, the sun was low and the temperature had dropped almost 20 degrees from what it had been in the city. I had chosen a place far from the main campground, an old service road marked on an outdated map I found at a used bookstore. It hadn't been maintained in years, and weeds grew through the cracks in the dirt path. I parked my beat-up 91 Bronco in a small clearing surrounded by tall ponderosa pines. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. There was no wind, no far-off traffic, just that stillness you get in deep woods where every little sound stands out. I pitched my tent about 30 yards from the truck, close enough that I could get to it quickly if I needed to, but far enough to feel truly out there. The ground was covered in a thick layer of needles that muffled my footsteps. I gathered firewood, the sound of dry branches snapping echoing softly between the trees. By the time I had a fire going, the last of the sunlight was gone. The sky was a hard black, stars scattered like salt, and the moon was just a thin slice. I cooked a simple dinner, canned chili heated over the fire, and sat there eating with my gloves still on. It was peaceful. I kept catching myself staring into the dark between the trees, not because I was afraid, but because there was something hypnotic about the way the firelight stopped abruptly, leaving the rest of the forest in shadow. Around 10, I banked the fire down and crawled into my tent. The cold hit me quick without the flames. I zipped the sleeping bag tight around my shoulders, pulled my wool hat down over my ears, and lay listening to the quiet. Somewhere far off, I heard an owl, then nothing. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke to the sound of footsteps. They weren't heavy, just soft crunches on the bed of pine needles, but deliberate. The kind of sound that makes your brain snap into full awareness before you even open your eyes. I lay still, breathing slow, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or an elk. I'd seen plenty earlier in the drive, but the steps were too careful. They paused now and then started again, circling. I could hear them moving around the tent, slow, steady. My first thought was that it was another person, maybe someone camping nearby who had stumbled on my sight. But I hadn't seen a single car on the road in, and I was miles from the main campground. Then I heard it just outside the tent, maybe 5 feet away. A sound like someone trying to imitate a person's voice, but failing. It was a sharp, awkward mimic of what could have been a cough or a short laugh, but it was wrong. It was the way a recording sounds when the tape is warped. The hair on my neck stood up so fast it almost hurt. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps started again, moving toward the truck. I could hear them in the dirt now instead of the needles. Something brushed against the side of the tent, making the nylon ripple. I sat up slowly, my hand on the flashlight. I thought about unzipping the tent, but the idea of whatever was out there seeing me first made my stomach turn. The footsteps moved away again, into the trees. I could hear them for a long time before they faded completely. Eventually, I let myself lie back down, but sleep didn't come. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke again to the faintest sound of my name. Not loud, not whispered, just spoken. The exact tone my brother uses when he's trying to get my attention from across a room. But my brother was hundreds of miles away. The voice came from outside the tent. Then, a second later, from farther away. Then, from the opposite side. It wasn't just moving, it was shifting location too quickly, as if whoever was making it could glide silently between spots. That was when I decided I wasn't waiting until morning. I grabbed my boots, my jacket, my sleeping bag, and shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't even bother taking down the tent. As I slammed the Bronco's door, my headlights lit up the tree line ahead. For a second, I saw something tall, thin, hunched slightly forward, skin stretched tight and pale in the high beams. Its arms were too long, hands almost reaching its knees. The head tilted in a way no person's neck could manage. It turned away before my mind could process all of it, disappearing between the trees in two long strides. I didn't stay to watch. I threw the truck in gear and tore down the service road, the suspension groaning at every rut and rock. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where I pulled over, hands shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something running along the side of the road, keeping pace with me. The next day, I went back for the tent. It was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing inside had been touched, but around the campsite, in the bed of pine needles, I could see tracks. Not boot prints, not paw prints, just long, bare impressions, each one too wide for a human foot, spaced far apart like the stride of something that barely needed to try when it walked. I didn't camp alone again for years after that. Even now, when I do, I make sure there's another vehicle nearby, someone else I can hear breathing in their own tent when I wake up in the dark. Because sometimes, when the wind dies and the forest goes still, I think I can hear that same wrong laugh, far off in the trees, getting closer.